Welcome back to Patristica, and I hope you're well. I'll just give a couple of minutes to see if anyone joins the live stream, but if you're joining the recording, then a very warm welcome. I apologise for the lack of videos over the last couple of weeks. Mark, and I were in Chicago a couple of weeks ago, and this weekend just gone, I was in Krakow. So we've been really busy, sort of flying across the world, doing all these different things. But hopefully now we can return to some normal schedule. And as part of that, I am so excited about some of the guests we have coming up. And in particular, the ones we met at NAPS, the National American Patristics Conference, because we got talking to so many people about their research, what they did. And it's really a great time at these sorts of conferences to get to know each other a little bit better, not just personally, but also in terms of research, because conversation can happen more freely than it would do usually either in a debate format or in books. Rather, over a beer seems like the appropriate place to discuss this early Christian history. And it's the hope, as well as the guests that we're going to have on, to present individually our papers that we gave at the conference. Myself, Marcus Vincent, and Mark Bilby, along with Jason Badoon, who once appeared on this channel with us for a discussion, presented together on Marcion of Sinope. And I think the panel went down well. The papers were all good. I fluffed mine a little bit because of the length, and so this video is in some way a redemption for that, to present the video in full so that you might get a good understanding of what I was trying to say, and also give you some context more broadly about scholarship and the history of scholarship. One of the reasons that I wrote this paper was because it struck me that the issue so often with early Christian study is fundamentally due to the lack of double checking of former colleagues. I've talked ad nauseum on the channel about J.B. Lightfoot and Theodore Zahn and some of the mistakes that I think they made, and some of the great work of William Cureton, which no one even looks at anymore. But often this is true about a whole variety of subjects, not just Ignatius of Antioch. And I want to talk more generally, just briefly, about the history of scholarship on the New Testament, early Christianity more broadly, and then also, if I may, give a case study, which for those of you familiar with the channel will know very well about, but just to give an example of how the reliance on other scholars has caused issues. And I suppose, root problem that they've left us with is this division between canonical and non-canonical texts. And all of the other issues are just symptoms of that one root disease. And so it's from here that I want to begin the paper. Now, I've got the chat open, so if you want to ask a question at any time about a specific point, please do super chat if you can. That'd be really helpful to support the channel. And I will stop the paper halfway through if that happens. But otherwise, I'll be around at the end to answer a few questions as well. When one looks at theology departments in universities across the world, the undergraduate and postgraduate modules concerning early Christian texts are often split in two. The first studies the text of the New Testament, which is often subdivided into courses on the Gospels, Pauline epistles, and the Catholic epistles, etc. And the second category includes everything else, until and sometimes even including the councils of the 4th century. This split is, to say the least, uneven, with the 27 books of the New Testament receiving far more attention than the hundreds of texts composed over the next 3 centuries. Anecdotally, my master's in 2018-19, I was offered 5 modules pertaining to the New Testament, but only 1 concerning early Christian literature from the 2nd to the 5th century. The fruit of this institutional bias towards the New Testament over early other Christian texts can be seen in the number of academics specialising in each area. In 2024, the Conference for the Society of Biblical Literature was attended by approximately 7,000 scholars, whereas the International Conference on Patristic Studies in 2024 had an attendance closer to 1,000. The disparity in attendance is, of course, not reflective of the quality of scholarship represented at either conference, and there is undoubtedly a crossover between some of the attendees who studied both the New Testament and other early Christian texts. However, the sevenfold increase in the attendance at SBL is the natural outworking of the institutional and scholarly tilt towards the New Testament laid bare. However, as Marcus Vincent rightly points out, the division of patristic and New Testament studies is a rather recent one. This separation, he continues, was the result not only of a romantic turn of scholarship in the mid-19th century, but also of a fundamentalist, non-historical reading of the New Testament. Somewhat counterintuitively, it is also the case that the revival of the study of patristic literature partially led to the problematic division. To fully understand what Vincent is referring to, and to understand why the patristic literature even needed reviving, let us remind ourselves briefly of the history of scholarly interest in patristic literature. Many detailed accounts have been produced by colleagues on the origins of the New Testament canon and the effects of dividing texts into categories of canonical and non-canonical on the formation of Christian belief and later scholarly inquiries into early Christianity. Although there are some issues with these accounts, which we'll look at in a moment, many have made some astute observations about the impact of studying the origins of early Christianity with such a strict separation between the two groups of texts. Michael Holmes, for example, rightly summarizes from his study on the Apostolic Fathers that prior to the 19th century, the Apostolic Fathers had almost no impact upon the study of the early church. Eusebius, as an early church historian, made good use of them, but this was an isolated example. This neglect of the Apostolic Fathers was partly due to their relative obscurity owing to the lack of extant witnesses. However, in the 16th and 17th centuries, non-canonical material was rediscovered, and texts like 1 and 2 Clement and the Corpus Ignatianum were beginning to be brought into the conversation. Despite this rediscovery, however, two significant factors thwarted progress. First, the intense theological disputes following the Reformation. As debates raged on fundamental doctrines, such as the threefold ecclesial hierarchy or the nature of communion, theologians would sometimes come to conclusions on the authenticity of a text without providing supporting evidence, often based on whether it supported their theological position. An acute example of this sort of bias played out with respect to the Ignatian epistles, with Catholics such as Cardinal Baronius defending the Ignatian corpus due to its favourable depiction of the episcopacy and the Eucharist, and reformers such as John Calvin arguing vehemently against them. Both sides provided little, if any, supporting data for their conclusions, but yet their opinions were deeply entrenched. Second issue was the relative lack of trustworthy manuscripts. And I should say here, though I didn't put it in the text itself, that I am very sympathetic towards this as a reason for neglecting the Apostolic Fathers, at least in their early discovery. As Holmes notes concerning these then newly discovered texts, there, quote, remained some question as to their authenticity, since they were still closely associated with a large number of spurious documents bearing similar titles or claiming the same authorship. Fundamentally, however, to my mind, these two issues were only symptoms of a bigger issue, namely that the patristic texts were not considered canon. It would almost certainly not have been the case that if the early councils had decided to include one or all of these patristic texts in the canon, then the manuscript tradition would have been far richer, and the theological disputes would have been contained to questions of interpretation rather than textual authenticity. With some notable exceptions, it was not until the 19th century when the Apostolic Fathers started to garner more attention. The Tübingen School, spearheaded by F.C. Bauer, along with his students, including Eduard Zeller and David Friedrich Strauss, played a pivotal role in this revival and reassessment of early Christian history, with reference to non-canonical texts. Subsequent scholars, such as Theodor Zahn and J.B. Lightfoot, continued this revival and sought to establish the texts of 1 Clement and the 7 letters of Ignatius and the Middle Recension as genuine. A plethora of other excellent minds began to write concerning the Apostolic Fathers, including Francis Xavier Funk, Adolf von Harnack, Cursor Blake, Walter Bauer, Hermann Kulster, among others, with the last 200 years really seeing the Apostolic Fathers come ever more into the spotlight. The Apostolic Fathers are not the only figures to have enjoyed this relatively newfound attention over the last century. Other early Christian figures, which have somewhat problematically been labelled Gnostic, have also enjoyed the attention of our colleagues. Figures such as Valentinus and Basilides and Montanus, and of course for our channel Marcion, among others, have been the subject of more scholarly inquiries over the last 150 years than ever before. However, this attention, a positive trend though it is not without its issues. As mentioned at the beginning, the amount of scholars working on this cornucopia of texts is a fraction of those working on the New Testament. And this problem is compounded by the fact that many of those who are working on this period do so within a canonical framework, separating the study of the 27 New Testament texts from the rest. This separation from an historian's perspective is problematic. One can sympathise with enforcing such a division in the field of theology, where the aim is to discern truth claims based on texts that were recognised later by the Church as authoritative. But for the historian, such a division must be put to one side. It is not only an anachronism to imagine such a canonical book, such a canon of 27 books in the 2nd century, but it also imposes a blunt distinction between a non-canonical and canonical period. It almost suggests that after the ink of the final new had left the author's quill as he wrote Amen in Revelation 22:21, the period of the canon ended and a patristic era began. In reality, such a moment never occurred, and we're all well aware of this. Yet it has somehow come to define the way in which we study early Christianity, and it's placed constraints on how we approach the texts, much to our detriment. Although this canonical and non-canonical period did not exist, and the 27-book canon, especially in terms of what we think about in the 2nd century, is an anachronism, that is not to say that other canons in the 2nd century were not being compiled. Indeed, the subject of this panel, and indeed our YouTube channel, Marcion of Sinope, published what was likely the first New Testament sometime in the 140s, comprising his antithesis, the Evangelion, the Pauline corpus of 10 letters. And yet, I am unaware of any university course dedicated solely to the study of the Marcionite canon. Of course, I say this with a degree of tongue-in-cheek, but from an historian's perspective, whether one's focus be on the canonical New Testament or early Christianity more generally, Marcion's New Testament demands attention on several fronts. And if I might at this point just break from the paper for just a moment, I want to talk about a conversation I had after the panel with two colleagues. The first with one who said, well, we teach non-canonical texts, and actually our university theology department was founded on the idea that we would always teach New Testament and non-New Testament texts as one. And I thought, wow, oh my gosh, what an oversight in my part to have missed such a prestigious institution that has this endeavour. But yet when I went to their website to see how this was manifested, I found modules attributed or dedicated to the Gospel of Matthew, one to the Gospel of John, one to the Synoptic tradition more generally, one to the Pauline epistles, one to the Catholic epistles, and then yet again one to the rest of early Christian literature. And to my mind, this is still a problem, because no matter how hard we protest that we're going to do this, removing of the barrier, it's only if our research manifests this that we've actually made it somewhere. And I'll go on to talk about this in a moment. But just on the subject of never being aware of a course solely dedicated to Marcion's New Testament, and I'm going to talk in a moment about why I think that is actually not so much of a joke as one may first think. I then had a chat with Jason Badoon, who is a brilliant scholar. And if you haven't checked out the video we did with him, I just cannot recommend it enough to you. And his work on Marcion is absolutely top drawer. But even he does not spend much of his time teaching Marcion at his institution. And so if people like him are not teaching it, then we might ask, well, whoever would? I do spend slightly longer on Marcion during my courses than probably most would, but even I am guilty of not possibly giving him as much attention as I should do. That leads me on then nicely to the next part of the paper. Marcion's New Testament demands attention on several fronts. Firstly, as the first New Testament that we can trace, it stands as one of the most significant milestones in the history of Christianity. And I don't think that this can be disputed. Wolfram Kinzig, for example, wrote an absolutely brilliant article called the Kaine Diatheke, in which he outlined how we can trace this, and it's absolutely brilliant. Sorry, just bear with me one moment. I lost my place there. Second, the Marcionite New Testament provides another valuable window into the state of Christianity in the 2nd century. So irrespective of whether one believes that it's the first New Testament or not, or the first version of these texts or not, it's still a massive part of what we can know then about the 2nd century in a place where there's a huge lacuna of texts. Third, Marcion in his New Testament prompted several, sometimes quite lengthy responses from those who disagreed with him. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Origen, Tertullian, and Epiphanius, amongst others, saw Marcion's influence as significant enough or threatening enough to necessitate a rebuttal. We may also note the longevity of Marcion's beliefs, as they are still being discussed at the time of Augustine and beyond. Fourth, and most importantly, irrespective of one believes whether Marcion redacted the canonical text, or as is the consensus of this panel and YouTube channel, that Marcion's canon largely preserves the older reading of these texts, the relationship between the canon and Marcion's New Testament is undeniable. As such, they are a part of each other's history and must be studied together. By studying the text together, without the constraints which come along with the categories of canonical and non-canonical, one can allow them to dialogue with one another more freely. For example, rather than approaching the text with preconceived ideas concerning authorship and dating and the underlying assumptions that Marcion redacted the canonical section, we can assess how the two sets of texts relate to one another. Among other things, we may look at stylistic, lexical, or thematic differences between the texts to spot patterns of potential editors or redactors in an effort to trace their evolution. This has been done for Marcion most recently by some of the members of this panel, like Mark and Marcus. To show the benefit of looking at the text without the restraints mentioned above, I wish briefly to show just a couple of examples of their findings with respect to the Marcionite Apostolos when compared to the canonical epistles. Now, it's at this point that I do not see the need to repeat myself here, as much of what I state here is already on the channel in one form or another. So if you are interested in some of those details about what sort of things we look for potential styles of redactors or editors or recensions of the text, then just make your way through our back catalogue. I appreciate it's long, but I hope you'll find so much there of the evidence that we're putting forward. So then, if I may, I'll just jump to the conclusion. The aim of this article has not primarily been to prove or disprove one position, and same with this channel in some respects, but not been to prove or disprove one way or another with respect to the debate of the evolution of the Pauline epistles. This would take much longer and several volumes, which are forthcoming this year. Rather, it's been to show that if you remove the artificial barrier between canonical and non-canonical texts, it can open up scholarship to reading these texts together and reassess the relationship between them and the emergence of early Christianity more generally. Assumptions about the origins and authorship of Christian literature, influenced by the labels of canonical and non-canonical, have often led scholars to tying themselves up in knots in attempting to answer questions that simply have no answer, like the synoptic problem. When one rids themselves of these assumptions, less time is spent trying to justify seemingly impossible hypotheses. The case of Marcion's Apostolos, for example, and the canonical Pauline corpus is a primary example of how removing the labels can be helpful. Rather than trying to justify the consensus hypothesis that Marcion mutilated the canonical text and in doing so changed the style, lexicon, grammar, and theology in an almost impossible manner that would require the skills of the most accurate and diligent redactors of all time, or even that of AI, we can now explore new possibilities, as indeed we on this channel and panel have done. Instead of working out how the apostolos was redacted, the data from this team's research, which we have briefly covered here, but that was on the panel, more widely on this channel, we can suggest that it was actually the opposite that is true, that the apostolos came first and the canonical text that we have in our Bibles came afterwards. Moving forward, it is my hope that church historians would read texts without such prejudice before them and refrain from assuming the dating and authorship based on canonical and pre-canonical labels. But rather than just allowing this to be a matter of lip service, it would become a practical methodology for us all. So this is the paper that I gave, and I think it's so important actually because it often seems like the obvious, and so often it's the obvious that goes right under our nose. The underlying assumptions about pre-canonical or canonical texts that affect not only our view of them from a bias point of view, particularly if you're a Christian, obviously, but also from its dating. So I give you one fine example is that most scholars no longer believe that the gospel authors are who they say they are. That the canonical version we have of either Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John are by those people. But yet scholarship has not managed to rid itself of the traditional datings of those texts in their canonical form, with many still placing Mark at 70, Matthew 80, Luke 85, John around 100, something like this. It seems strange to me that we're willing to say, well, it's probably not all Matthean, but we'll still stick with that date. In addition to that, then, if we can keep the constraints of the dating on us, we end up still puzzling over questions like the synoptic problem. I was explaining to a group of colleagues that every year when I show my students the synoptic problem and the possible models, such as the 2-source, the 3-source, the 4-source, the Farah, whatever it might be, they all say to me, but Jack, this is obviously wrong. Like there's something in the picture we're missing here. And I think they're absolutely right. But I don't think that the problem is the models necessarily, although they're all wrong. I think the problem is the question we're asking and the methodology we're approaching it from. Namely, if we just assume there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then hypothesize a load of other documents to fit our narrative to make that happen, because the dating that we've assumed says that this is the dating 70, 80, 100, that is the issue we find ourselves in. This I found obviously more plainly also with the Ignatian epistles, where we find again and again people trying to justify the Middle Recension's existence in the early 2nd century, but yet not being able to quote people who know it, nor having good manuscript data to show that. Apart from now, we have this fragment from some Manaeans, which I probably need to talk about on this channel at some point. So you see, the purpose of this paper again, is not to convince anybody either way. And I still don't care whether you believe that the canonical version or the pre-canonical version, as we call it, came first of either Ignatius or Marcion. But rather, I just ask that whatever constraints we have on our scholarship based on these anachronisms, we try to dispense with them. And even from a Christian point of view, this is possible, right? Because I'm still saying that you can impose those labels or divisions on texts that are for theological discerning, but it's for the sake of the historian that we must drop them. Well, that brings me to the end of the paper. The paper is only 20 minutes long in these sorts of things, and I hope you found it at least thought-provoking. And hopefully I will be able to publish the paper soon with all of its details, including the examples I used from Marcion and the canonical to justify some of our new dialogue suggestions. However, as I mentioned, I didn't see a great need to place it here because all of this is on the channel and many of you will be familiar with it already. I'll just give 1 minute just to see if there's any questions. I can see there's 18 of you watching, which is great. And while I do that, I just want to reiterate again how grateful my wife and I were for kind words for Patricia cat number 2, Gimli, who got run over just 2.5 weeks ago. Your condolences meant a lot, and we're very grateful. The saddest person or saddest creature in the house is unfortunately Patricia cat number 1, little old Minky. But we are looking to get a Patricia dog within the coming weeks. So hopefully that might be a new companion for him that he might learn to love. So no questions and super chats coming through. So I suppose all of that is to say thank you very much for joining me, and to offer a final plea to look at the Patreons down in the description for Mark and me. They are so very helpful, and it goes a long way to supporting the channel. You know, Mark and I don't do this for the money at all, really. But to cover our costs for things, it's sometimes very helpful, particularly as costs for things like StreamYard and video editing software go up. So anything you can afford or spare, that'd be much appreciated. In the meantime, I wish you all the best. Have a great day. Bye-bye.